They found him curled beside the crib. The blanket was soaked through with rain, and his fur had started to stiffen from the cold. But he didn't move until they touched the child. Some stories don't begin with sirens or shouting. Some begin with silence, with a breath you weren't supposed to hear, a crib not meant to be there, and a dog who had already decided this was where he'd make his final stand. This story will break you, and then rebuild you. Like, share, and tell us where in the world you are watching from today. The field wasn't on the map. The first thing I remember was the quiet, not the soft kind that comes after rain, but the hollow, heavy kind you only notice when it wraps around something living. We weren't even supposed to be out that far. The field didn't show up on any GPS. No signs, no fencing, just a wide, empty expanse of flattened brush and mud, bordered by the quiet skeletons of trees long dead. If we hadn't turned around when we did, we might have missed them completely. The first figure we saw was the crib. Plastic sides, white and worn down with mildew, tilted slightly on one leg. A baby blanket had blown partially off in the wind, revealing a small foot, unmoving. The second was him, a German shepherd, weathered and gaunt. His ribs showed through patches of soaked fur, the kind of thinness that comes not from days without food, but weeks. One ear was torn, the fur above his right eye split by an old, healed scar. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, he didn't even flinch when we stepped closer. He just looked at us with a long, steady look, and then, just once, laid his head back down beside the baby. No collar, no leash, just a silent sentinel wrapped around the crib like a dying ember, refusing to go out. The baby was breathing, faint, but steady. Tiny clouds of condensation rose from her nose in the cold air. I don't remember saying anything out loud. I remember kneeling. My boots sank into the mud. The rain had made everything soft, the earth, the air, my throat. The shepherd let me touch the crib. He didn't move, even when I lifted the baby into my arms. Her skin was cold. She didn't cry, just curled inward like something remembering the womb. But when I started to walk toward the car, the dog rose, slowly, stiffly. He limped on one leg, his back right paw dragging slightly in the grass, but he followed, never breaking eye contact, never making a sound, not a bark, not a whimper, like he'd been waiting for this, like his job was almost done. The rain didn't stop that day. The drive back felt longer than it should have. The baby was wrapped in a towel from my trunk. The shepherd curled behind my seat, still soaked, still silent. His nose was pressed against the side of her car seat, not touching. Just there. The vet would later tell me he'd been through hell, starvation, cold exposure, the beginnings of pneumonia. A splinter lodged in his paw, too deep to walk on without pain. But still, he'd stayed. And the baby, they never found out how long she'd been out there. A few hours, maybe more. But it was long enough to matter. No one came forward. No one claimed her. Just a crib in a forgotten field, and a dog who refused to leave it. He didn't eat the first night, not the second either. I left a bowl on the porch, a little away from the door, not close enough to feel like an invitation, just there, like the food might be for someone else. That's what he seemed to need. Space, permission, distance between past and present. The rain had stopped, but the sky stayed low, pressed in like grief that hadn't spoken yet. The kind of overcast that made sound feel heavier, like you had to whisper even when no one else was around. He laid on the wooden slats, curled tight the same way we found him beside the crib, as if his body had memorized that shape, as if letting it go might break something sacred. I sat inside with the light off, just a lamp flickering low by the window. Watching him, not studying, watching. There's a difference. You study something to understand it. You watch when you already know, but don't know why. He didn't sleep much either. His ears twitched at every gust of wind, every branch that creaked. His eyes never fully closed. Not really. Even when his lids drifted, his head would snap up. Seconds later, scanning the yard like he expected something to return, or someone. And sometimes, not always, but enough, he would lift his nose to the air and sniff. Once. Then again. Then pause. Not like a dog scenting a squirrel. Slower, heavier, like he was chasing a memory, or testing for something he hoped not to find. I stepped out quietly that third morning. The air was cold, sharper than it had been. Dew lined the railing, and the boards creaked beneath my weight. He didn't look up, just kept staring at the yard. Then, without moving his body, just his eyes, he glanced at me and went back to stillness. That was the first time I noticed it. The smell, faint, barely there, but unmistakable once it hits the back of your throat. Smoke, not campfire, not cigarettes, the kind that clings to fabric, that rides the collar of your coat long after you've walked away from something burning. I looked around, half thinking maybe a neighbor had lit something, but there was nothing, just the wind, the gray dot, and him, still waiting, wrapped in that invisible ache. He smelled like smoke, but I knew it wasn't from here. The blanket in my hands, they let me keep the blanket, the one from the crib, the hospital. Staff had asked if I wanted to discard it. Unsanitary, they'd said gently, molded from the rain, but I couldn't. Something about it felt tethered, like a thread I wasn't ready to cut. It was heavier now, damp wool, pale blue with stitched stars in one corner. There was a tear near the edge, like it had been caught on a nail or thorn, pulled with urgency. I held it in my lap that night, sitting across from him on the porch. The dog didn't move when I brought it out, but he saw it. That I know, because his eyes flicked down to it once, and something passed across his face, not recognition exactly, not relief, just something softer, a tiny breath against a wall of pain. And then he did something he hadn't done yet. He stood, not all the way. His legs shook under the weight, but he rose enough to stretch one paw forward, drag himself a few inches closer, slowly, no rush. I didn't move, didn't speak, just let the night breathe between us. He came as far as the step, then sat. His body trembled once from the cold, maybe, or memory, and he laid his head down, not on my foot, not against me, but near the blanket, near enough to smell it, and then finally he closed his eyes. Something about the way he waited. Baby was still in the hospital, under observation, they said. Too quiet. No obvious trauma, but no sound either. No cooking, no tears. She just looked, wide, watery eyes, following movement, but never reaching, like she'd learned, somehow, that nothing stayed. They asked if I'd seen any adult nearby, mother, father, anyone, but there'd been no tracks. No footprints in the field but mine and his. They told me it could have been a drop, abandonment, a panicked decision from someone who couldn't cope, but that never felt right, because he wasn't just guarding her. He wasn't new to her, not confused, not waiting for instruction. He was waiting for her to wake up, and when she finally did, the first sound she made wasn't a cry. It was a soft, throaty murmur, like the sound of a name she didn't know how to say. And the first thing she looked for wasn't a face, it was fur. The photo in the clinic 3 days later, I took him to the clinic. He resisted the leash, not aggressively, just anchored. His body told me that his voice never would. He'd been tethered before, and it hadn't gone well. So I let him ride free in the car again. Windows cracked. The air is moving slowly and cold. The vet was kind. Gentle hands. Calm voice. He scanned for a chip. Nothing. Ran blood work. Gave him fluids. Found that the splinter still lodged too deep in the paw, would need minor surgery. Nothing urgent, but painful. He nodded through it all, without so much as a whimper. But it was the photo in the waiting room that stopped him. Black and white. Faded print in a wooden frame. A memorial wall of dogs once rescued. One of them looked like him. Not exactly younger maybe, fuller face but the same eyes. Wide, steady. That looks like they'd already seen the worst and survived anyway. Stared at that photo like it hurt, like he'd known him. Like they'd been through something together. Or maybe like it was him, a former self, long gone. Some dogs bark at doors. Others wait by them. This one didn't do either. He sat just beside it, in the shadow where the porch light didn't reach, like someone who'd once been welcome and didn't know if he still was. I'd leave it cracked for him at night, not wide, just enough for him to know I hadn't closed him out. He never stepped inside. 3 days. 4. Still no name, still no sound. The vet had stitched his paw a quiet procedure. No sedation needed. He hadn't flinched once. Just stared at the ceiling, like it reminded him of something he'd already lived through. The baby remained in care. They gave her the name Eva just until someone came forward, but no one did. I visited her every morning. Her crib at the hospital was warm, clean, surrounded by the kind of quiet concern that only surfaces when no answers exist. The nurses whispered like she was sleeping, even when she was awake. She never cried. She just watched the ceiling. Sometimes her fingers would curl like she was gripping something unseen on the edge of cloth. Fur, memory, and always, before I left, I'd let her smell the blanket. Just a corner. She'd press her face against it and close her eyes, and I'd wonder again how long they'd been together, and how much they'd lost. He knew the road before I died in. The 5th day, I caved. I needed answers. Something real, something traceable. I kept thinking about that collar mark, the hollow place where a name had once pressed into skin. It had faded, but not enough to forget it had ever been there. I remembered how he'd sniffed, the wind that first night, the way his body seemed to lean toward something just beyond sight, so I drove. Nowhere in particular, just back toward the field, then past it. He sat in the back seat again, still silent, still watching. We passed nothing for miles. Abandoned roads, rusted mailboxes without numbers, puddles of old rain clinging to gravel, like bruises. I was ready to turn back when I noticed him. He shifted, just slightly. But his body leaned toward the window. Not urgent, not excited, just pulled. A few 100 feet later, I saw it. A driveway, or what used to be one. Overgrown, swallowed by vines and knee-high grass, but just visible enough to recognize. Someone once lived here. I pulled over. He didn't wait for permission. As soon as the door opened, he was out, not running, just walking. Limping still though. Better now. Straight into the brush, toward something he remembered. I followed. The house with no windows sat at the top of the hill, half buried under time. The roof slanted in, shingles missing. The front steps half rotted through, but the door was there, and the outline of a porch swing. And on the ground, in the dirt, a child's shoe, nearly swallowed by mud. He paused just before the steps, not out of fear, out of reverence. And I knew this was where he came from. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. His whole body became a memory. He sniffed the air, slow, deep breaths. His tail didn't move. His ears were down. But his eyes, God, his eyes, they carried something ancient, grief beyond speech. He stepped up once. The wood groaned under his paw. Another step. Then another dot. Then he stood at the threshold, nose against the door. He didn't push it open. He just leaned there, pressed into it, like he expected someone to open it from the inside. And I realized this wasn't a place he'd fled from. It was a place he couldn't return to. Not because he was lost, because someone else was gone. The crib and the smoke. I stepped closer. The air changed the moment I crossed the threshold, even with the door still closed. The scent was faint, but still there. Smoke, dry, cold, the kind that lingers in places long after the flames die. I Found a gap near the back of the house. A side window, shattered, vines curling through like fingers reaching back in. Inside, the walls were scorched in places. Not all the way, just patches. Rooms that told half-stories. There was a crib in the far room, collapsed now, blackened. One leg, cracked in half. Toys melted into the floor, and just past it a leash. Still clipped to the bottom railing. Empty. I turned. He hadn't moved from the front steps. His body is rigid now, waiting. I didn't need to call him. He already knew what I'd seen, because he'd lived it. The memory of running feet that night. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch again. He is beside me, closer now, almost touching. I watched the wind move through the trees and tried to piece it together. The field, the crib, the fire, the leash, and always, the silence. He must have gotten out, pulled free, carried her. Somehow, he had no collar. But the mark was there, and his eyes didn't scan for danger anymore. They scanned for her, not the baby, the other one, because I think now there'd be two. The scar beneath the thigh. Found it by accident. He'd let me brush him that night. The first time he didn't move away, and as I passed gently behind his shoulder, just under the fur, I felt it. A scar, jagged, fresh once, now healed. Too long to be from a fight, too straight to be random, a surgical line, or a burn. He flinched, just barely, but not from pain, from memory. I stopped. Let the silence hold us both. Then he leaned closer, just an inch, and sighed. A low, trembled breath that said more than any sound could have. It was raining again when I brought him. Not hard. Not the kind that turns sidewalks to rivers or lashes windows with spite. Just a steady whispering kind. The kind that turns the world into a hush. A blanket over breath. A pause in something already fragile. I'd called ahead to the hospital. I didn't ask for permission. I just said, he needs to see her. I think the nurse on the other end heard something in my voice I didn't mean to show. She didn't ask questions. She just said, come after hours. We'll leave the side door open. So I drove. The German Shepherd didn't shift in the back seat. Not once. Not like the first time, when his eyes had searched the windows as we passed each tree. Each broken fence post, like a marker on a map of grief. This time, he was still, not relaxed, but quiet, braced, like someone returning to a place that had never quite let them go. The hospital didn't make a sound. It was just past midnight. The halls were empty, floors freshly mopped. Overhead lights dimmed to a low gold hum. Not dark, not sterile, just tired. I walked slowly. My boots echoed, even though I tried to step gently. The dog followed close behind, no leash, no instruction, just presence. Like a shadow that had weight. We passed the reception desk. A single desk lamp glowed. The nurse nodded once when she saw me. Then her eyes flicked to him, and something inside her softened. I didn't stop walking. She didn't ask. Down the corridor. Past two double doors that released a breath of warm air as we entered. Into pediatrics. Room 12. I paused in the doorway, and he didn't. He passed me, silent as breath, and stepped into the room like he'd done it before. Like his body knew the exact placement of the crib. Like something ancient inside. Him had been waiting for this re-entry. The baby didn't cry, she was awake. Propped slightly in her hospital crib, eyes open. Not blinking. When he entered, her fingers moved, tiny, slow curls, not reaching, not clenching, just moving through the air like she was touching something she remembered. He came close, closer than I expected. His muzzle hovered just over the crib edge, still as bone. She turned her head. No sound passed between them. No bark, no coo, not even a whimper. Just that space, that invisible tether tightening again. It was a reunion without words, without proof, without logic. But it was real, because I felt it, in the walls, in the stillness, in the way time seemed to bend around them, like the rain outside had slowed to let them catch up. He laid down beside the crib, one paw beneath the rail, eyes up, watching, not guarding, not yet, just returning. A nurse who watched, and then looked. Away she entered quietly, clipboard in hand, but not writing. She stood there in the doorway for a long time, watching him, watching her. Then she said, soft as breath, "She hasn't made a sound all day, not until now." I turned. What kind of sound? She didn't answer for a moment, just tilted her head slightly, listening, then nodded toward the crib. I stepped closer. Ava's fingers had wrapped around one of the crib bars, not tightly, just enough that her hand stopped moving, and from her throat, not loud, not sharp, came a hum, not a tune, not a cry, just a vibration, like the body remembering how to speak. The dog didn't move, but his tail almost invisibly tapped once against the floor. The photograph left behind before we left. The nurse tucked something into my hand. "No one came back for it," she said. It was in her onesie pocket when she arrived, too small to notice at first. It was soft with water damage, faded almost to nothing, but still visible in patches. A woman, holding a baby, face down, sunlight on her hair, and just behind her a shape, a dark shape, a dog. It might have been him, might not. The shadows made it hard to tell, but I didn't ask. He didn't need the picture. He already carried it in his blood. The drive home wasn't quiet, not like before. This time, he sat in the front seat. I hadn't planned it. He just climbed up when I opened the passenger door, and I didn't stop him. He didn't sit straight. He curled slightly, his side pressed against the console, his head tilted toward the back seat, where the blanket lay, the one that had once held Eva. I watched him through the corner of my eye as we drove. He breathed slower now, still deeply, still aware, but not like a soldier waiting for the next call, like someone who'd made it through a battle they weren't supposed to survive. What the blanket carried back home, I laid it out again. Same spot, same porch. He sniffed it, gently this time. Then, slowly, folded one paw beneath him and curled in, just enough to let the edge of the blanket touch his shoulder. I sat beside him, no light, just the weight of dusk curling around the edges of the house. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the photo. He looked at it, longer this time, and then, for the first time since I'd met him, he made a sound. Not a bark, not a growl, just a low gravel-soft breath that caught halfway between a sigh and a whine, then silence again. But something had cracked, not broken, just let light in. The first night he came inside, the house felt smaller, not cramped, just fuller. Not because of his body, but because of his presence. Like the walls leaned in to make room for something that had long been missing. A weight, yes, but not a burden. A kind of gravity. He didn't wander, didn't sniff, or circle, or pace, like most dogs brought into unfamiliar space. He stood in the center of the living room for a long moment, then lowered himself to the floor, with the kind of careful, aching grace I'd come to recognize. Everything he did carried memory. He laid beside the crib, not touching, not guarding, just a present. And for the first time since the field I felt the house exhale. The baby's return, they released her the next afternoon. No official foster placement yet. No name on the forms except Eva, pending ID. They said I could keep her for the weekend, until we sort things out. I didn't ask how long that might be. I didn't want to know. I just took the car seat, the hospital bag, the paperwork that smelled like ink and bleach, and I brought her home. He was waiting at the door, not excited, not nervous, just steady. His body stiffened when he saw her, not with tension, but with something more subtle. A stillness that wasn't about fear or alertness, more like reverence, recognition. I carried her inside and laid her gently in the crib. He didn't move until I stepped back. Then, slow as dusk falling over the porch, he crept forward. No sound, but the faint scratch of his nails on the wood floor. He stopped just beside the crib, and sat, not the sight of obedience, the sight of a sentry who's come home. She reached for him first. She was drowsy, her fingers curled like petals folding in for the night. But as he lowered his head to rest beside the crib frame, something shifted. Her hand uncurled, floated toward him in the air, and landed on his muzzle. Barely a touch. Just a weightless rest of fingers against fur. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Her hand stayed there, and her eyes for the first time didn't wander. They locked, like two travelers finally meeting at the same mile marker on a road they'd forgotten how to follow. Feeding time was quiet. She didn't eat much. The bottle barely touched her lips before she turned her face away. But she didn't cry. She didn't resist. She just looked at him, still curled beside her, eyes half closed. I tried again. Warmer formula. Softer light. Nothing. Until I moved the bottle closer to where he lay. Then, only then did she drink. Tiny swallows, one after another. Slow but steady. And when she finished, I didn't need to burp her. She curled in, head toward the edge of the crib, toward the shadow of his body, on the floor, and slept. The crib became a circle over the next day. I began to see it, the rhythm forming between them. I'd step out to the kitchen and return to find her turned, not by me, not by chance, always facing him. No matter how I laid her down, she found her way back, and he matched her. Every shift she made, he mirrored. Not perfectly, but enough that it felt intentional. When she stirred, he lifted his head. When she whimpered, he leaned closer. When she coughed, his ears twitched, but he never barked, never whined. Not once. His silence was his voice, and she seemed to understand. The night she wouldn't settle it was late. The rain had returned, not heavy, just that slow, persistent drizzle that settles into wood and soul. She'd been fussy all evening. Not loud, just restless. Nothing worked. No bottle, no rocking, no lullabies, hummed under breath. She kept turning, eyes wide, hands reaching. So I stepped back, and he stepped forward. Not into the crib, never that, but to the side, close enough that his breath fogged the wood rail, and she settled. No touch, no words, just the sound of his breathing. It was then I noticed the cadence of his breath had changed, slower, deeper, like he was matching hers, or maybe she was matching him. Either way, the room stilled, and sleep returned to both of them. The photograph on the table, I kept the photo by the window now, the one from the hospital. The woman, the baby, the shadow of the dog behind them. It blurred more each day, water damage creeping in, curling the edges. Soon, the image would be gone. But he looked at it still, every morning, just once. Then, I walked away, and every evening he'd do the same, not out of habit, out of something older than that. Ritual, memory, devotion, maybe even grief. The first time he looked at me, not glanced at, not measured, looked. It was just after sunset. She was asleep. The house is lit by lamp glows and the occasional stretch of headlight passing down the gravel road. I sat on the floor beside the crib. He was beside me, and I said, not loud, not even meaning to, I don't know who she was to you. His ears shifted. Slightly, but I think you loved her. I didn't expect anything back. But he turned his head, looked straight at me, not with challenges, not with fear, just witness, as if to say, you don't need to know. You just need to keep her safe. By the end of the week, I stopped calling it temporary. Not out loud, not to the nurse who called to check in every few days, not to the caseworker who asked if I needed more diapers or formula, but in my head, something had shifted. The baby wasn't just here. She belonged here, and somehow, so did he. The word foster felt wrong every time it tried to surface, like a placeholder for something we already knew the shape of. but hadn't said aloud. They weren't just guests. They were gravity. He changed the way the house moved. It started slowly. The doors didn't creak as loudly when he passed. The wind didn't shake the siding as much. The mail didn't thud on the porch. It arrived quieter, somehow, like the world knew. Someone inside was listening harder than before. He didn't bark, ever, but he would sit near the front window each morning, body tall, still, alert but never tense. If a car passed too fast on the gravel road, his ears would turn, and that was enough. I never once saw him chase, growl, or flinch. He was piece-shaped like a dog, but it was more than that. He shifted the air. Rooms felt different with him in them. Not lighter, not warmer, just anchored. Like nothing could slip away without him noticing, especially not her. She followed him without walking. She wasn't crawling yet. Her legs were still unsure, her weight unsteady. But she followed him, with her hands, with her breath, with her eyes. Wherever he was, her gaze would land, and stay. Sometimes, I'd set her in the playpen by the window, and he'd rest just beside it. Not inside, never inside, but close enough that his back touched the mesh. She'd press her hand against it, just once, and then relax. Every time they are never tired of watching each other. Like each one was the thread that kept the other from unraveling. The vet noticed I took him in again 2 weeks later. A routine follow-up for the paw. The vet greeted us quietly, respectfully. She'd seen how he moved, not just physically, but through the world, and had stopped trying to force normal procedures. He sat still as she examined the scar tissue. Let her check his lungs. She nodded. He's single quotes S healing, she said. Slower than most, but deeper. I didn't ask what she meant, because I already knew. Some wounds weren't visible, and the ones that weren't the ones that changed you most. Ava's first laugh wasn't at May, was in the kitchen. Making coffee, bleary, half listening to the monitor, while she rolled gently in the playmat in the living room. Then I heard it. Not a cry, not a babble, a laugh. Light, short, like something had caught her by surprise and made her forget. She wasn't supposed to feel joy yet. I stepped to the doorway. She was lying on her side, face tilted up, and he was lying beside her, head lowered, one ear flicking lazily, tail curled against his leg. He wasn't doing anything, just watching her, but something in that look had made her laugh, and I realized that was the first time the house had heard laughter in months, maybe years. I dreamed of Smoke a Goonie. Don't dream much, not real ones. Not the kind you remember after waking. But that night, it came back. The field, the rain, the crib. But this time, the dream didn't stop at rescue. I saw it in reverse, smoke rising, into air that hadn't yet caught fire. A house is still whole. A leash clipped to a crib leg. A woman's silhouette moving between windows. And the dog younger, fuller, bounding through leaves with a child on his tail. Not Eva, another one, just older, just before. I woke up with my chest tight. Not afraid, just aching, because I think the dream wasn't mine. The collar, I found it in the basket by the back door. One I hadn't opened since I moved in, a mess of old leashes, harnesses, and forgotten things from before. At the bottom, something wrapped in cloth. I didn't remember placing it there, but when I opened it, the collar lay in my hands. Not his, not the one that had left the mark on his fur, but it looked close. Worn leather, the faint glint of a tag that had long since rusted beyond recognition. No letters left, just weight, just shape. I brought it to him, hold it out. He didn't move, but his eyes darkened, not with fear, with memory, and slowly he turned away, like it belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't here anymore. They moved as one by the end of the 3rd week. It became impossible not to see it. She would rise in the morning, and before I even lifted her from the crib, he'd be waiting in the doorway. If I sat her on the floor, he'd lay beside her. If I carried her out onto the porch, he'd follow, and not stop watching until I placed her in the cradle swing and stepped back. She reached for his fur now, not tugging, not grabbing, just resting her hand there, like it anchored her to this place, to this moment. And he let her. Not just needed her to. You could see it in his posture, the way his breathing changed when she was close, the way he folded into stillness only when she was within arm's reach, like she was a tether to a world he still hadn't forgiven but was learning to live in again by the time the third Sunday came. The house no longer felt like mine, not in the way that meant loss, but in the way you watch something soften into the shape of what it was always meant to hold. The hallway lights seemed dimmer in the morning, not burned out, just softened, as if trying not to wake her too quickly. The floors creaked differently, not randomly, like they were answering the rhythm of small feet that hadn't yet learned to walk, and the shepherd had begun to linger in doorways more often, not blocking, not guarding, just being there. I never taught him where the rooms were. He just knew. The day the mail carrier hesitated, it started with a pause. I was in the kitchen, pouring formula, the baby's bottle cap between my teeth, when I saw the mail truck stop at the edge of the drive and stay longer than usual. I stepped to the front window, the baby in my arms. The shepherd had already beaten me there. He stood in profile, framed in the half-glow of morning, not rigid, not tense, just tall, still watching. The carrier opened the mailbox, reached in with letters, and then, with a glance up, I froze. The dog didn't move, but something about his posture said, "I see you. I remember what it means to lose. I won't let it happen again." The carrier set the mail down slowly, gave a brief wave toward the window, and drove off. That was all. No bark, no sound, but the message had been sent. The baby felt it too that night. After the mail truck left, I caught her doing something I hadn't seen before. She was sitting in my lap, looking past me toward where he lay by the door. I thought she was just staring, the way babies do when their vision catches something undefined. But then, slowly, she raised her hand, held it out, palm open, and curled her fingers in, twice a wave. Not learned, not taught, just felt. He didn't react right away. Then, slowly, he rose. I walked to her side, sat and bowed his head, not as a trick, not as a command, as an answer. The porch became sacred ground every morning. He beat me to it. I'd open the front door, arms still sore from rocking her through the restless pre-dawn hours, and he'd already be waiting there in the same spot, same stillness, looking out over the gravel road, as if expecting something, or someone. Some mornings he sat for 5 minutes, others, nearly an hour. The rain didn't move him, nor wind, nor sun. Only once, when a truck backfired 3 houses down, did I see him rise sharply, eyes narrowed, shoulders lifted. But again, no bark. He just watched, memorized, stored it, then, as if satisfied, returned to the crib side. What she did in the mirror, she was beginning to mimic things. Not words, not gestures, but feelings. I carried her past the hallway mirror one afternoon and caught her staring, not at herself, but at the reflection behind her, the dog, sitting just far enough back that only part of his body appeared, her hand raised. She didn't look at her own image. She looked at him, and smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile you give to a toy or a face or a funny sound. It was the kind you give to a familiar shape, a presence, a memory returning. And in that moment, I wondered, had she seen him before she was old enough to remember? Was he the first thing her eyes ever really held? The caseworker didn't understand. She came 2 days later, soft-spoken, wore her worry like a scarf, not loud, just ever-present. She asked the usual questions: diapers, feeding schedule, sleep patterns. I answered them all. Eva curled in my lap, drowsy from a warm bottle, and the shepherd resting a few feet away, head turned toward us like a silent vow. When she saw him, She hesitated. You let him stay that close? She asked gently. I nodded. He doesn't make her nervous. I almost laughed, but stopped myself. No, I said. He makes her steady. She scribbled something into her pad. I'll need to note that, she murmured as she stood to leave. She glanced once more toward the dog. He didn't meet her eyes, but I think he knew. She didn't understand what he was. Not yet. The sound of fabric at midnight that night. I heard a sound I couldn't place at first. Not crying, not a storm, just movement. I stepped down the hall, barefoot, lights off. The baby was asleep. The monitor glowed blue beside the crib. All seemed still, except the faint swish, swish, swish of something brushing wood. I opened the door gently. He was there, head pressed low against the edge of the crib, and the blanket had fallen halfway out. She had kicked it off, and he had pulled it back, not with teeth, with his nose, slowly, gently, over her legs, over her side, until it tucked against her shoulder. Then he rested his head again and exhaled, and the room held that breath like prayer. The sound of a name not spoken. I found a journal in the drawer of the hall table. Not mine. One left by the previous tenant, maybe even earlier. Inside, only a few pages were filled. Most were grocery lists, reminders, but on the back page, scrawled in ink, now faded too gradient, forget her name. Even if they do. That was it. No signature. No explanation, but something about it pulled at me. Not just the words, the handwriting, the pressure of it, the way the pen had pressed harder into certain letters, like someone had written it through tears. I looked up. He was in the doorway, watching me, and for the first time, I didn't just feel curiosity. I felt grief, like someone's story was still trying to be told, and he was the only one left to carry it. Peace doesn't announce itself. It settles, but when it leaves, it doesn't slam doors. It knocks, soft at first, barely noticeable, and yet it's enough to change everything. It was the 4th Monday since the field, a month, give or take a day, and the shepherd had begun sleeping, all the way through the night. That morning, when I opened the bedroom door, I didn't find him standing alert at the crib like usual. He was in the hallway, curled in the shaft of light near the baseboard, nose tucked under his paw, still, breathing evenly. The baby stirred behind me, her hand reaching upward before her eyes opened, and for a brief moment, just one, I thought we made it. We're safe now. But peace is delicate, and sometimes, it only lasts long enough to teach you what you'll miss when it's gone. The man in the parking lot almost didn't notice him. I was loading formula and wipes into the back of the truck. Rain misted gently across the windshield, and Eva was asleep in the car seat, bundled in a hooded blanket with one hand resting on her cheek. Then I felt it, not fear, something behind me, not movement, not presence, just attention. I turned. He stood across the lot, half shielded by the corner of the pharmacy awning. A man, hands in pockets, too still for someone waiting on a ride. His head tilted, not toward me, toward the truck. I didn't say anything, just watched him. He didn't wave, didn't speak, but after a few more seconds, he stepped back, disappeared around the side of the building. I waited. I walked the length of the lot. He was gone. The shepherd knew before I did. He was at the front door before I even pulled into the drive, not standing braced, his body low, weight forward. One paw slightly lifted like he'd just begun to move, and froze mid-step. When I opened the car door, he didn't bark, but he stayed in position, watching the road. Not me. Only when I carried Eva out did he move. He met us halfway up the porch, circled once around my legs, and stopped just behind me, not touching the baby, guarding her. From what? I still didn't know, but something in him had changed. The calm was still there, the breath, the silence, but now there was tension in the air, like the part of him that once waited beside a burning crib had stirred again. The letter with no return address came the next morning, folded in half, slid between the slats of the porch railing, like a message left by someone who didn't want to be seen. No envelope, just a slip of paper for words, block letters, no greeting, no signature. You have something of mine. That was all. I read it once, then again, no name, no accusation, just certainty. I didn't call the police, not yet. Instead, I sat on the porch, with it in my hands. The shepherd beside me, eyes never leaving the horizon. I didn't need to show it to him. He already knew, because when I set the note down, he didn't sniff it. He growled, not loud, not deep, just once, low, like something buried waking up. The baby knew too that night. Eva wouldn't sleep, not in the crib, not in my arms. She cried, not loudly, not angry, just constant, a thin, unyielding sound, like a string being drawn across the edge of glass. I walked her through the house, whispered lullabies I didn't remember learning, held her until my arms ached. Nothing helped, until he stepped into the hallway. He didn't approach, just stood at the threshold of the nursery. She turned in my arms. Her crying stopped, mid-note. She stared at him, silent, and then, slowly leaned toward him. Her forehead pressed against his snout. No movement, no sound, just touch, and for the first time that night, she exhaled and slept. The photo on the back, while the caseworker came again. Her eyes lingered too long on the collar I'd placed on the table, the one I'd found in the basket. She asked again, about ownership. Did I know who the dog belonged to? Was I prepared to surrender him if someone came forward? The word surrender didn't sit well. I looked over at him, lying beside Eva as she napped, her hand tangled in the fur near his neck. I said he belongs to her. I just opened the doors. She scribbled something and said, "We're starting to get calls." I asked, "From who?" She hesitated, then said someone claims he was theirs. Months ago, said they lost him in a fire. My chest tightened. I asked, "Did they mention a child?" She blinked. "No, just the dog." The wind brought the smoke back that evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, and the sky went that strange purplish blue. The scent returned, faint, familiar. Smoke, not the thick kind, not choking. The after kind. What clings to a jacket left on a chair? What settles into skin when no one washes the grief out? He smelled it before I did. His head lifted, nose tilted upward, ears perked, then so gently I almost didn't catch it. He stood. I walked to the front door and sat waiting. I didn't sleep. That night, I sat on the floor beside the crib, one hand on the wood slats, one eye on the door. The shepherd didn't move from his post. He faced the hallway, back to us, guarding not just her, but the threshold itself. I didn't ask him what he remembered, what had burned, who had walked away. But in that stillness between midnight and morning, I knew something was changing. Something was coming, and he would not let it pass without a witness. The air changed before the knock ever came. It was in the way the light shifted across the living room floor. Longer shadows, a colder hue. It was in the way the birds fell silent before dusk, like the trees knew to hush themselves. And it was in him. The shepherd by then, his body knew the shape of every hour. He'd rise before the baby stirred, sit by the door at exactly 7:15, and return to the crib before sleep set in again. But not that day. That day, he didn't move at all. He just watched out the window, through the blinds, unblinking, and even when I called his name, the one I'd started using in private, whispered at night when Eva was sleeping, he didn't look away, as if to say it's coming. The knock, that wasn't loud, it didn't slam, didn't rattle the door or jolt the walls. It was softer than that. 3 slow knocks, measured, controlled, and somehow more unsettling than if someone had screamed. The shepherd stood, instantly, quietly, no hesitation. He positioned himself between the crib and the door before I'd even reached the hallway. Not growling, not barking, just a present, like a question answered before it had even been asked. I scooped Eva into my arms. She stirred, but didn't cry. She pressed her cheek into my collarbone and went still. I didn't turn on the porch light. I just opened the door half an inch. The man from the lot, it was him. The same man I'd seen in the pharmacy parking lot 2 weeks earlier. His clothes looked the same: gray jacket, scuffed shoes, collar turned up like it had been caught in wind and never straightened. He didn't look at me. Not directly. His eyes scanned behind me, into the house. Then, like he'd been rehearsing the words, he said, "I think you have my dog." My grip tightened on Eva. The shepherd hadn't moved, but his breath had changed. Slower, deeper, a warning without sound. I stepped forward. "Where'd you last see him?" I asked. The man blinked. Once. Slow. There was a fire. Rural house. Early spring. We lost everything. He looked down at his hands. The dog disappeared during the chaos. Thought he'd run. He paused, but then I saw the photo online. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a printed screenshot. A photo I hadn't posted. Someone else must have. A local shelter page. Blurry. The shepherd lying beside Ava's crib. The blanket over her legs. He held the photo up to the porch light. I'd recognize him anywhere. No mention of the girl. He talked about the dog, his coat, his eyes, the way he used to fetch a worn tennis ball until it split at the seam, but not once. Did he ask about Eva? Not about her name, her age, how she came to be here. I asked him carefully, "Were you alone when the fire happened?" He paused, shook his head. "My sister was with me. She'd brought her kid over that week. Baby girl. Visiting. From out of town." He looked up, finally, right at me. They didn't make it, and for a moment, the world tilted. The breath in my lungs changed shape, because I realized something that struck harder than any threat. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the truth either. Not all of it. The shepherd didn't move. I opened the door a little wider. The shepherd stepped forward, not to the man, to me. He placed himself at my side, between me and the screen door, eyes fixed on the visitor, his body still, his shoulders tense. And I swear, without sound, without gesture, he was asking me, not for permission, for faith, to trust that he knew, that whatever this man was, claiming no matter how carefully spoken, something didn't fit. I didn't respond, not with words, but I stepped back, and I closed the door. The letter on the windshield the next morning, I found it tucked under the wiper of my truck. Same handwriting, same block letters. "You can't keep what isn't yours." No envelope, no return address, just certainty. I stood in the driveway holding that piece of paper for longer than I should have. The gravel crunched behind me. He was there, not running, not pacing, just standing in the frame of the door, eyes watching the back of my hand as it trembled. I folded the paper in half, and he walked to the porch and sat, like he was done chasing ghosts, but not done protecting what remained, what the baby knew that night. Eva didn't sleep in her crib. She fussed when I laid her down. Not a cry, not fear, just discomfort, disease. I picked her up, carried her to the armchair in the nursery, and sat with her chest against mine. She turned her head sideways, eyes half closed, breathing steady. The shepherd lay beside us on the rug, not curled, not at rest, alert, watching the shadows. I thought she was asleep. Her body is still, so quiet. But then I felt her hand, reaching, searching, until it found the edge of his fur, and there her fingers tangled gently into the ruff of his neck. A tether, and for the first time since the knock, he closed his eyes. I called the caseworker the next morning. I told her everything, not just the man, not just the letter, but the feeling, the way the shepherd had placed himself in front of the baby. The way Eva hadn't relaxed until his breath returned to normal. The way no part of her had reached for anyone but him. The caseworker was silent. On the other end, then she said, "We had another call." I asked, "From him?" "No. From someone else. A woman. Said she used to live with the family in that house. Said she remembers a shepherd, yes, but also remembers something else." She paused. "She says the dog never left the baby's side, even after the flames started." I sat down, she continued, quietly. "Says she thought he died in the fire. The days that followed didn't feel like days. They felt like pauses between something that had already happened and something we were still trying to name. The baby still slept. The shepherd still watched. The wind still moved through the trees. But everything in the air felt waiting. I watched the road more than I used to. Left the porch light off. Sat beside Eva longer after she'd fallen asleep, as if my presence could hold something in place that wanted to be undone, and still he stayed. He'd sit near her crib until her breathing slowed, then shift to the hallway, never sleeping deeply, ears alert to sounds I couldn't hear. He'd become the shape of safety itself, and I'd started to believe maybe that would be enough. Until the papers came. The envelope with the crested arrived in an unmarked van. No sirens, no escort, just a plain vehicle and a woman in a blazer with a clipped tone and soft shoes. She handed it to me without eye contact. Didn't step past the porch. Didn't ask to come in. Just said, "I'm sorry," and left. The envelope was heavy. The seal, real. Inside. Typed forms, court-stamped, legal language I barely followed. Words like petition, possession, and formal claim. Attached was a single-page statement from the man who knocked, a name now, a date, and a demand. He was filing for the return of the animal, not the child, not the girl, just the shepherd, as if he were an object, a misplaced possession, something to be reclaimed. The shepherd watched me read it, didn't tell him. Not out loud, but he knew. He sat across the room as I read the letter 3 times over. The baby curled in her playpen, the shadows moving across the floor like low tides. I didn't cry, I didn't speak, but my hands curled around the paper like I could squeeze the words into dust. And that was when he stood, walked to me, laid his head, very gently, against my knee. It wasn't comfortable. It was a question. "What will you do? But will you let them take me from her?" And I didn't answer, because I didn't know how. The girl knew what was missing that night. He left the room just once. He'd been lying beside the crib, her fingers tangled, again in his fur, when he rose. I walked to the living room, stood by the window. I followed. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't move, just stared at the porch. I stepped outside. No wind, no sound, but something had been left behind. Another letter, taped to the door, this time, in the same block print as before. "We both know who he belongs to." I didn't bring it in. I let it soak in the night air. But when I returned to the nursery, was awake, eyes wide, not crying, just aware, and her hand, which had been touching the blanket only moments before, reached toward empty space, where he used to be. I called the caseworker again. Her voice was thinner this time. I told her about the letter, about the papers, about the threat that didn't use the word threat, but carried it anyway. She said, "He has a legal claim. If he files, and there's no microchip, no registration to dispute." "He left her," I said. Quiet, but sharp. She paused. "You can't prove that." He didn't ask about her. Not once. Just the dog. Another pause. Then, "And if the dog doesn't legally belong to her, then I finished it for her. Then he doesn't either." And suddenly, I couldn't breathe. Because the world had always been this way, hadn't it? Paper mattered more than presence. The silence before the storm the next morning. The house was still. The kind of still that feels like a breath held too long. Eva didn't make a sound when she woke. She just sat up, I looked toward the door, waited. The shepherd entered moments later, and for the first time in days, she smiled. Not wide, not loud, just enough that her entire body softened, and she reached for him. I watched them from the hallway. The way her hand rested on his shoulder like she'd done it 1,000 times, like she'd never known anything else, and I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. I called the number on the form and asked to meet him again. The second meeting it was a quiet parking lot behind a community center. Cold pavement, no traffic. He arrived in the same jacket, same shoes, same empty stare. He didn't shake my hand, didn't offer a thank you, just said, "So." I had the shepherd with me, on a leash, for the first time since the field. The man crouched, patted his knee, clicked his tongue. "Come on, boy. Let's go home." The dog didn't move, didn't growl, didn't bark, but his head turned toward the truck, toward the back seat where Eva sat, watching through the glass. I said, "She's the one he chose." The man stood. "That's not how this works." "Maybe not," I said, "but it's how he works." He stepped forward once. The shepherd stepped back, and for the first time, the man saw it. The answer had already been given. He walked away. He didn't argue, didn't threaten, just looked at me, long and hard, and said, "You'll lose." Eventually then turned. Got in his car, and drove. I stood there in the quiet. For a long time, the leash still slacks in my hand, the shepherd beside me, watching the road. It had rained in the night, but the house woke up warm. The windows were streaked with water and morning light, and Eva stirred before the birds began their chorus, not crying, not restless, just turning softly beneath her blanket. She was changing, not in sudden ways, not like growth charts would measure, but her gaze lingered longer. Her hands reached with purpose, and when she looked at him, the shepherd, there was something knowing in her face, like she understood not just what he was, but why was he still here. I had stopped asking, stopped wondering if he would leave, because now, when he looked at her, and then at me, I saw it clearly had already made his choice, and that was something no court could undo. The visit that didn't happen, the man never returned. No calls, no second petition, no officers at the door. The caseworker told me quietly over the phone that he'd chosen not to proceed, said he no longer believed the animal could be reintegrated, but I knew what that really meant. He saw it. Dots in the truck, in the dog's eyes, in the small child whose entire body leaned toward a memory she hadn't been given, only kept. He saw what I saw every morning. You can't take back what was never really yours. You can't retrieve devotion like a lost set of keys. It stays where it belongs. What he did that morning, I watched the shepherd move differently that morning, not tense, not alert, relaxed. He followed Eva to the front window, where she sat with her hands against the pane, tracing the path of a single drop of rain as it slid down the glass. He lay beside her, not just nearby, his side against hers, his tail curled in the same direction as her feet, and then for the first time since the field, he laid his head down completely, eyes closed, breath slow, not because he was tired, because finally he didn't have to be ready. The collar and the frame. I took the old collar, the one I'd found wrapped in cloth, at the bottom of the hallway basket, and laid it on the table beside the photo, the faded image, the woman, the shadow of the dog. I've looked at that picture every day since I'd found it, but now, I framed it, simple wood, nothing ornate, and I set it on the shelf above the fireplace, not as a mystery, not as a keepsake, but as proof, not to anyone else, to us, that something was once broken and, somehow, in the quiet, had made its way back to wholeness. Ava's first word wasn't a word. She was lying on her belly, kicking gently against the floor. Her hand tapped the edge of the rug, her eyes fixed on his fur. He was asleep, fully asleep now, the kind of sleep he'd never allowed himself before. The kind you only fall into when you believe no one's coming to take anything from you anymore. And then she made a sound, not loud, not clear, but deliberate. A breath that caught a vowel pressed against the edge of her tongue. Jew. It wasn't language. Not yet. But it was aimed at him, and when his ears twitched, and he opened his eyes, she repeated it. Softer, almost a whisper. Guh. He stood, stretched, moved to her side, laid down again, and she rested her hand on his paw. I took down the crib I had, waited, even after she stopped using it. Even once she'd outgrown the need for the rails and padding, I left it up. A reminder, maybe. A symbol of the field. That first image burned into my mind, the shepherd curled around its legs, rain falling, blanket soaked, the world trying to forget them both. But that afternoon, I disassembled it, screw by screw, slat by slat, and when it was done, I didn't cry. I sat on the floor, where it once stood, pressed my palm to the wood, and said, thank you. For what it had held, for what had survived inside it, the leash. We never used it, hung on the back hook for weeks, new leather, brass clasp, clean. I had bought it the week after I brought him home, thinking foolishly that I'd need it, that there would come a moment when control was required, but we never used it. He followed without being asked, stayed without being tethered, protected without being trained. So I took the leash and placed it in the same drawer where I'd once found the old collar, not as a tool, as a reminder that love can't be forced. It only walks beside you because it chooses to. He stopped. Sleeping by the door one evening, I noticed something missing. He wasn't in the hallway, not by the window, not curled near the entry rug. I found him at the foot of her bed, Eva, now in a toddler cat, breathing softly beneath a cotton sheet, her hand still curled around a stuffed bear, and him, lying there with his head on his paws, facing her as if to say, I don't need to watch the door anymore. Nothing outside matters more than what's in this room. And I understood. He had stopped waiting for the past to return. He was living in what had survived. Final, emotional beat. End of section. That night, I stood in the doorway longer than usual. Eva asleep. The shepherd beside her. The rain had returned. Light this time, barely audible. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just let the quiet bloom. And in that silence, I realized this wasn't about rescue anymore. Not about saving her, or him, or even myself. This was about belonging, about choosing to stay, day after day, long after the storm passes. And as I turned off the light, the last thing I saw was his tail shift one's hand, the girl's fingers reaching, even in sleep, for something she already knew would be there when she woke. Mornings came slower now, not because time moved differently, but because we let it. We no longer rushed to meet the clock. The house had settled into a rhythm made of small sounds, the scrape of paws on hardwood, the thump of a toddler's steps, the creak of an old window frame breathing with the breeze. Peace doesn't come all at once. It arrives in fragments, moments. A stillness you learn to trust again. The shepherd was aging. I saw it in the way he rose now, slower, more deliberate, in the way his eyes stayed closed a few seconds longer each morning. But he never failed to get up when she did. He waited for her, every day, and she never looked for anyone else first. The day she walked to him without falling, she took her first steps just before winter began, not into my arms, not toward a toy, or food, or the voice of someone calling. She walked to him, for unsteady steps, a wobble, one hand out, the other curled at her chest, like she was holding her breath. He didn't move, just lay there, steady as stone, watching her with an expression so still it felt like prayer. And when she reached him barely upright, she fell forward gently onto his chest. No cry, no fear, just the sound of her giggle against his fur, and a sigh from deep within him, the kind of sound a being makes when something long unfinished finally arrives. She Called him something like a name. It wasn't a word, exactly. Not yet. Just a breathy, two-syllable whisper she'd started saying each time she reached for him. "Ba-do. At first, I thought it was just sound. Baby language. A shape of noise that meant nothing. But she only said it when she looked at him, only reached her arms out when he entered the room. Tail low and slow, head slightly lowered in reverence. Ba-do. And when she said it, he always came to, if he remembered, somewhere deep beneath everything that had been taken from him, that he used to have a name, and now, at last, someone had given him another. The quietest Christmas I ever remember. We didn't put up a big tree, just a small one on the side table, lit with soft white bulbs and a few hand-cut paper stars she'd crumpled in her tiny fists before. I taped them in place. There were no gifts wrapped, no stockings hung, just a blanket spread across the floor, where we sat in the glow of the lights. She pressed her forehead to his, giggling in bursts, her hands tangling again in the thick of his fur, and he let her, always. "That's not how this works." "Maybe not," I said, "but it's how he works." He stepped forward once. The shepherd stepped back, and for the first time, the man saw it. The answer had already been given. He walked away. He didn't argue, didn't threaten, just looked at me, long and hard, and said, "You'll lose, eventually." Then turned, got in his car, and drove. I stood there in the quiet, for a long time, the leash still slacks in my hand, the shepherd beside me, watching the road. It had rained in the night, but the house woke up warm. The windows were streaked with water and morning light, and Eva stirred before the birds began their chorus, not crying, not restless, just turning softly beneath her blanket. She was changing, not in sudden ways, not like growth charts would measure, but her gaze lingered longer. Her hands reached with purpose, and when she looked at him, the shepherd, there was something knowing in her face, like she understood not just what he was, but why was he still here. I had stopped asking, stopped wondering if he would leave, because now, when he looked at her, and then at me, I saw it clearly had already made his choice, and that was something no court could undo. The visit, that didn't happen. The man never returned. No calls, no second petition, no officers at the door. The caseworker told me quietly over the phone that he'd chosen not to proceed, said he no longer believed the animal could be reintegrated, but I knew what that really meant. He saw it in the truck, in the dog's eyes, in the small child whose entire body leaned toward a memory she hadn't been given, only kept. He saw what I saw every morning. You can't take back what was never really yours. You can't retrieve devotion like a lost set of keys. It stays where it belongs. What he did that morning, I watched the shepherd move differently that morning. Not tense, not alert, not relaxed. He followed Eva to the front window, where she sat with her hands against the pane, tracing the path of a single drop of rain as it slid down the glass. He lay beside her, not just nearby, his side against hers, his tail curled in the same direction as her feet. And then, for the first time since the field, he laid his head down completely, eyes closed, breath slow, not because he was tired, because, finally, he didn't have to be ready. The collar and the frame. I took the old collar, the one I'd found wrapped in cloth, at the bottom of the hallway basket, and laid it on the table beside the photo. The faded image, the woman, the shadow of the dog. I've looked at that picture every day since I'd found it, but now I framed it simple wood, nothing ornate, and I set it on the shelf above the fireplace, not as a mystery, not as a keepsake, but as proof, not to anyone else, to us, that something was once broken and, somehow, in the quiet, had made its way back to wholeness. Ava's first word wasn't a word. She was lying on her belly, kicking gently against the floor. Her hand tapped the edge of the rug, her eyes fixed on his fur. He was asleep, fully asleep now, the kind of sleep he'd never allowed himself before. The kind you only fall into when you believe no one's coming to take anything from you anymore. And then she made a sound. Not loud, not clear, but deliberate. A breath that caught a vowel pressed against the edge of her tongue. G, U. It wasn't language. Not yet. But it was aimed at him. And when his ears twitched, and he opened his eyes, she repeated it, softer, almost a whisper. Guh. He stood, stretched, moved to her side, laid down again, and she rested her hand on his paw. I took down the crib I had, waited, even after she stopped using it. Even once she'd outgrown the need for the rails and padding, I left it up. A reminder, maybe, a symbol, of the field. That first image burned into my mind. The shepherd curled around its legs, rain falling, blanket soaked, the world trying to forget them both. But that afternoon, I disassembled it, screw by screw, slat by slat, and when it was done, I didn't cry. I sat on the floor where it once stood, pressed my palm to the wood, and said thank you, for what it had held, for what had survived inside it. The leash, we never used, hung on the back hook for weeks, new leather, brass clasp, clean. I had bought it the week after I brought him home, thinking foolishly that I'd need it, that there would come a moment when control was required. But we never used it. He followed without being asked, stayed without being tethered, protected without being trained. So I took the leash and placed it in the same drawer where I'd once found the old collar, not as a tool, as a reminder that love can't be forced. It only walks beside you because it chooses to. He stopped. Sleeping by the door one evening, I noticed something missing. He wasn't in the hallway, not by the window, not curled near the entry rug. I found him at the foot of her bed, Eva, now in a toddler cot, breathing softly beneath a cotton sheet, her hands still curled around a stuffed bear, and him, lying there with his head on his paws, facing her, as if to say I don't need to watch the door anymore. Nothing outside matters more than what's in this room. And I understood. He had stopped waiting for the past to return. He was living in what had survived. Final, emotional beat, end of section. That night, I stood in the doorway longer than usual, Eva asleep, the shepherd beside her. The rain had returned. Light this time, barely audible. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just let the quiet bloom, and in that silence, I realized this wasn't about rescue anymore, not about saving her, or him, or even myself. This was about belonging, about choosing to stay, day after day, long after the storm passes. And as I turned off the light, the last thing I saw was his tail shift once and the girl's fingers reaching, even in sleep, for something she already knew would be there when she woke. Mornings came slower now, not because time moved differently, but because we let it. We no longer rushed to meet the clock. The house had settled into a rhythm made of small sounds, the scrape of paws on hardwood, the thump of a toddler's steps, the creak of an old window frame breathing with the breeze. Peace doesn't come all at once. It arrives, in fragments, moments, a stillness you learn to trust again. The shepherd was aging. I saw it in the way he rose now, slower, more deliberate. In the way his eyes stayed closed a few seconds longer each morning, but he never failed to get up when she did. He waited for her, every day, and she never looked for anyone else first. The day she walked to him without falling, she took her first steps just before winter began, not into my arms, not toward a toy, or food, or the voice of someone calling. She walked to him, for unsteady steps, a wobble, one hand out, the other curled at her chest, like she was holding her breath. He didn't move, just lay there, steady as stone, watching her with an expression so still, it felt like prayer. And when she reached him barely upright, she fell forward gently onto his chest. No cry, no fear, just the sound of her giggle against his fur, and a sigh from deep within him, the kind of sound a being makes when something long unfinished finally arrives. She called him something like a name it. Wasn't a word, exactly. Not yet, just a breathy, two-syllable whisper she'd started saying each time she reached for him. Ba-do. At first, I thought it was just sound. Baby language. A shape of noise that meant nothing. But she only said it when she looked at him. Only reached her arms out when he entered the room. Tail low and slow, head slightly lowered in reverence. Ba-do. And when she said it, he always came to, if he remembered, somewhere deep beneath everything that had been taken from him, that he used to have a name, and now, at last, someone had given him another. The quietest Christmas I ever remember, we didn't put up a big tree, just a small one on the side table, lit with soft white bulbs and a few hand-cut paper stars she'd crumpled in her tiny fists before. I taped them in place. There were no gifts wrapped, no stockings hung, just a blanket spread across the floor, where we sat in the glow of the lights. She pressed her forehead to his, giggling in bursts, her hands tangling again in the thick of his fur, and he let her, always,